So welcome back, everybody. It's my great privilege to introduce our next speaker, Professor Dubash. He's a professor at the Center for Policy Research, where he conducts research and writes on climate change, energy, air pollution, water policy, etc. He's one of India's most eminent people working in this field, also extremely well known internationally. He's currently a coordinating lead author for the IPCC and advises the United Nations in a number of ways, including as a member of the Scientific Advisory Group of UN Climate Action, the group of UN Climate Action Summit. Nationally, he's a member of several committees and groups, including the group that developed India's low carbon strategy for inclusive growth. He's the winner of the 2015 T.N. Khushbu Memorial Award, the author of several books and over 70 articles, the winner of the 2018 Energy Regions Award and the S.R. Sen Award for the best book in agricultural economics and rural development. So we are extremely thrilled to have you with us, Professor Dubash, and look forward to your views on various aspects. As is clear from his title. Let me also say that Professor Dubash has kindly agreed to also join us in the panel discussion at the end of the meeting I was telling you about, and we very much look forward to your views in that forum as well. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I'm really delighted to be joining you here. My thanks to the organizers, to Professor Gopakumar, Professor Trivedi, and other organizers. My only regret is that I'm not there with you in person. I heard Professor Srinivasan a little while ago, and he was talking about how nice it is to do an in-person presentation, and I do miss that. But I will be very happy to also have questions in the course of the discussion if anything comes up. So I understand that this is a workshop really aimed at trying to lay the ground for climate studies, predominantly focused on questions of science. And I've been asked to talk about more of the sort of policy issues and try and set the stage for that. I am not going to try and presume to even provide advice on what science related questions are worthy of research or are needed for research in India, but rather try and kind of lay out the landscape on the policy side so that you would be in a better position to then make those links for yourself. So I will try to be sort of open-ended and not very directive. As the talk title suggested, there are a few different things that I thought I would cover today. So I thought it might be useful to give you a little bit of a potted history of the climate negotiations and explain what India's role in those negotiations has been. I'm using the phrase here that Ambassador Shyam Saran, our lead negotiator from a few years ago, used when he called India a premature power in climate negotiations. Then I thought I would talk a little bit about the policy framework and give you my views on the emergence and the development of that policy framework, and then conclude with a few sort of puzzles and questions going forward. So I'm just going to try and go through a few things in this talk, and I'm going to start a little bit with the climate negotiations. Not assuming that others in this room or virtually have a great deal of experience in this area. So why is climate change such a difficult challenge to address? I'm going to really start at the beginning here. Well, one way of thinking about it is the scale and scope of the issue. We are talking about nothing less than halting what has been a 150-year co-evolution of industrial development in fossil fuels. Life, as we know it today, what we call civilization, what we call development, is essentially a co-evolution with fossil fuels from the time of the steam engine onwards, and we are basically trying to unwind that process. The second is the scope of what we have to do. Almost every endeavor of human endeavor is going to be implicated in how we address climate change, whether it's how we manage water, it's how we feed ourselves, land use, certainly how we create jobs and industries, and so on. So that's the scale of the problem. The second is there are many conflicting interpretations on climate change itself quite aside from the scientific complexity, which we just heard about in the last session. Is it an environmental issue? Is it fundamentally an issue of justice that has to do with who has emitted more emissions and when? Is it a technical transition issue, as some people have said? Is this really a question of a renewable energy transition and then everything else will follow? So different people involved in this debate interpret the problem differently and do so at different times to suit their interests. So it's a very complicated set of issues because we don't even talk about it the same way, and it has this enormous scale and scope. Plus, there's the uncertainty. Now, how do we then solve this very complicated problem that we don't even know how to talk about in a way that we can all agree? Well, we do it through this very blunt mechanism called UN conventions. So this is what these rooms look like. This is a picture of the Copenhagen COP. You have all these countries sitting around with these flags, and the secretariat will typically put a text before the countries. One by one, the countries will put up their flags and they will insert objections or they will insert qualifications, and they will put in place new text around which there will be placed square brackets. And they will do this for a week. And then the second week will be a process of trying to remove the square brackets one by one and trying to get convergence on text. It's a very cumbersome process indeed. And then in the meantime, of course, while that is happening inside the room, this is what is happening outside the room, where you have often tens of thousands of people showing up now at COPs and lots of sort of vigorous activity. So I just want to give you a little bit of a sense of, the way in which we're trying to solve this problem often has to do with both sort of internal politics and these formulaic UN processes, and of course, a lot of external politics, and they're not well suited to this very nuanced sort of issue. So just to give you a little bit of content, I'm going to go back and take you through some of the key moments and what they meant. So back in 1992, the countries of the world agreed to a framework convention, which tried to answer the question, who should act and on what basis they should act. And a key issue, particularly for India, was this idea of common but differentiated responsibility and respective capabilities. And this is a very legalistic kind of process. And this is an absolutely critical phrase for India. It even has its own acronym, CBDRRC. And it basically says, yes, we have a common responsibility, but it is differentiated based on who caused the problem and who is capable of addressing it. And the Indian ambassador actually played a big role in inserting this but in this phrase. At one point, it was actually an and there have been PhD theses written about the and to but transition and so on. So fast forward to the mid-1990s, and the way these processes work is you have a protocol that kind of, a convention that lays the groundwork, and then you have a protocol that operationalizes it. So the Kyoto Protocol said that we are going to divide the world into Annex 1 or developed countries and non-Annex 1 or developing countries. And Annex 1 countries should act first. Now, after achieving this agreement, the US in particular said, look, we're not very happy with this approach. And because of political changes in the US, they didn't ratify the Kyoto Protocol, thereby hamstringing this effort from almost its inception. And this will be old news to many of you, but it's worth quickly kind of going through what the key issues were. Fast forwarding again to 2009, the question became, all right, we've had the first phase of the Kyoto Protocol where Annex 1 countries had more responsibility than non-Annex 1 countries. So is it time for developing countries to step up? And developing countries obviously said, well, look, it's not like you guys have done very much. In particular, the US has not even ratified this. So why should we do more? And so the framework of the Kyoto Protocol really started sort of falling apart. And this question about common responsibility or differentiated responsibility was really at the heart of it. And in fact, the Copenhagen Accord was sort of salvaged at the end, but it was very nearly a complete sort of derailment of the international process. It took several more years through to Paris to actually reform the architecture of the international negotiation process. And I'll come back to exactly what Paris did in just a minute. But then most recently, we've had the Glasgow Pact in 2021, which in a sense completed the framework that was put in place in Paris. And we also saw in Glasgow the emergence of these net zero targets. Now, rather than taking you blow by blow through all this, I want to step back and walk you through a way that I like to talk about the politics and the issues, which is really conceptual. And this will give you kind of a framework for understanding the last 20 to 30 years of negotiations. So I like to think about this as a trilemma of sorts. A trilemma, of course, is something where you have three objectives and you can only achieve two of them at a time. You have to decide which one to forego. Here the three objectives are environment. And this is what I was asking you when my computer crashed. Can you see my mouse? Somebody can just give a thumbs up sign, or can you see my mouse when I move it, or can you see it when I move it over here on the screen? Yeah, if somebody in the front row could just indicate a thumbs up if you can see my mouse. Yeah, okay, good. All right. So the idea is you have the environmental objective, which is avoiding dangerous anthropogenic climate change. You have an equity imperative, which says, look, we can't be solving climate change if it comes at the cost of poor people. And then you had a third objective, which is actually not enshrined in the Framework Convention. The other two are, which is competitiveness, which is why the US said, look, we're not going to sign the Kyoto Protocol. And because they said, if this means that our industry becomes uncompetitive with regard to countries like China, which are rising, then we are not interested, right? So these are the three objectives. Now, what are the possible solutions to this? The solution that India never formally put forward, but a lot of developing countries put forward, was said, well, let's address the equity and environment problems. And we'll do that by saying, look, there's a finite amount of carbon space that we have in order to address this problem. And we can calculate how much space we have through computation of a carbon budget. We figure out a decision rule to allocate that budget, a per capita rule or some other rule. And then we all know where we stand and we stay within that budget. And anybody who wants to exceed their budget has to buy emissions from somebody else. The problem with that approach, of course, is that by most people's calculation, the rich world had to go to zero almost tomorrow, right? And so it was not politically feasible for the rich world to either reduce their emissions to zero or to have to buy emission credits from the poorer world, the developing world. So the second option was a Kyoto Plus option, where developed countries said, we will do what we can in our countries. We're going to do a lot. But implicit in that was that the developing world had to do the rest. And this is what happened at Copenhagen. And a colleague of mine wrote a very evocative paper titled, Who Does the Residual? And essentially it became a situation where Germany and other countries said, we will reduce our emissions 80% by 2050, which sounds like a very big number. But when you do the math, it actually meant that when developing countries had to do the residual amount, they had to limit their emissions at very low per capita levels. Right? So developing countries said, this is not going to work for us. So what was left? The only thing left really is this third leg of the trilemma here, which is where you focus, where you allow countries to put down voluntary contributions that they deem, each country deems consistent with competitiveness and development needs, right? And this is essentially where Paris came out. And it's the only way in which to manage the politics of the climate trilemma. So the US and Europe could put in place what they felt they could do without hindering their competitiveness. India and China and other countries could put in place what they felt they could do without hurting their development prospects, right? So this is really where we ended up with. Now, just to then take us back to what Paris actually said, because this is important for the context of India's actions. Paris took on this question of differentiation between countries or symmetry across countries, which was sort of the core political issue, by hedging a little bit. What they said is developed countries should continue taking the lead, while developing countries are encouraged to move over time towards emission reduction or limitation targets. Essentially, it said, if you feel ready, you should cross over into behaving like an Annex 1 country. And then, of course, there was a lot of behind the scenes arm twisting. So South Africa and Brazil, among the large countries, were moving in this direction. India and China, a little bit less so. And every country was then asked to put on the table a nationally determined contribution, NDC, on mitigation and adaptation. So what is different from the Kyoto days is that these are not commitments, these are pledges. It's very important. This is so the Paris Agreement didn't put in place substantive commitments, it put in place procedural obligations. Every country was only obliged to submit a pledge, not to achieve an emissions outcome. Okay. And these were not the amount of emissions that went into that pledge were not to be determined by negotiation. It was to be determined bottom up by each country. How then were you going to meet the ultimate environmental goal? Well, every 5 years, you would ask countries to ratchet up their emissions, their pledges, and there would be this stock take that would be done every 5 years to see where we were collectively with regard to what is required by science. Now, there was also sort of weak promises of finance and technology support for developing countries, but these remain a bone of contention. So what did this add up to, right? This is an annual graph that is produced by the UN Environment Program, and I've involved in this in some sort of incidental way. And what they basically do is they compute the gap every year. And if you look at this diagram, countries, so these are the various emission trends required based on different temperature ranges. Now, we can't get into this here, but what's very interesting is these are all least cost pathways, right? These are pathways that presume that the emissions reductions are allocated in a least cost way across countries. They do not take equity into account. So this is the business as usual pathway. If we were in 2010, whatever policy environment persisted then. This is the current policy scenario as of 2019. So policies have made a difference. And these are the two NDC lines. One is conditional on finance and one is unconditional. And you can see that the gap, even from 2 degrees, is on the order of 12 to 15 gigatons, and the gap to 1.5 degrees is on the order of 29 to 30 gigatons. And this is on a base level of emissions of around 50 gigatons in 2015. So the gap is substantial, right? So how then do we interpret Paris? Well, I think Paris led to a few questions in terms of how we think about this problem. Is this in fact a global collective action problem where you decide your objective and then you carve up the pie? Well, it's not designed in that way. It's designed as an aggregate of national development and economic choices. So what do we do with the gap? Well, we've seen that the pledges do not add up to science. The question is, do they stimulate bottom-up action within countries in such a way that countries will move ever faster and countries will find that it is less costly and less problematic to reduce emissions than they otherwise had thought? In other words, will countries overachieve their pledges, right? So that's kind of the optimistic view of Paris, that every country will put on the table something quite conservative and then they will overachieve it. So let's not worry too much about the pledges themselves. And the idea is to stop talking about what countries should do and to stimulate action. So you create a tipping point towards green growth. The other question is, will Paris be fair? Will it stimulate action in a way that is consistent with responsibility and capacity? You remember those two terms from the phrase CBDR-RC. And what are reasonable benchmarks for fairness? How do you decide what is fair? These all remained unresolved questions that continue to plague the negotiations. I want to just quickly introduce the idea of net zero emissions. And many of you will have seen this phrase being kicked around in the build-up to the Glasgow negotiations. The net zero idea, and it's extremely interesting because in climate politics, a lot of these ideas emanate from academics, in this case from scientists at Oxford, who said, look, what we need to be thinking about is how we globally, collectively reach net zero emissions by 2050. And this got embedded in the IPCC's 1.5 report. The scientists did a lot of sort of media work, politicians picked it up, and it became kind of the main narrative for the Glasgow COP. And I have some views about this that I can come back to. But the idea is that net zero, in a sense, if you look at the trilemma, could be thought of as a way of refocusing what countries do down here at the bottom end of this trilemma back to the environmental goal. But what also happened as a result of the net zero conversation is people started asking the question, well, look, does equity still matter if we all have to get to net zero? Does equity still matter if we have to get to net zero, if the carbon budget is only about, gives us only another 15 or 20 years of emissions? In other words, how much effort should we be making on dividing up an ever shrinking pie, right? And so the net zero conversation did a number of things to change the politics. Most important, it introduced the idea of net, which is that it's not just your reductions, but also the sinks. You could also enhance sinks of emissions. And so the prospect that you could actually keep increasing your emissions and hope that technology allowed you to reduce them later. But then it also changed the politics of how you talk about this division between North and South, especially if all countries were driving towards zero, were expected to drive towards zero in the foreseeable future. So let me switch gears now and talk a little bit about India and India's role in all of this, and then I'm going to shift to the policy story. So Shyam likes to call India a premature power in climate politics because we punch above our weight. So it's a country that is important in climate politics, even though we do not actually, from a development point of view, have very basic and fundamental development challenges to address. And this cartoon here kind of indicates, this was something that came in the New York Times right before the climate COP, and it shows a sleepy looking Indian elephant kind of blocking the Paris train. And our environment minister at the time, when asked about this, said, well, I see it quite differently. I see the Indian elephant being run over by the Paris train. And it kind of indicates, the two ways in which you can look at India as defending our own development needs, legitimately so, or being an obstacle or being obstructionist. And for many years, through until about 2015, India was seen as kind of an obstructionist power in climate politics by some of the Western countries, because we were emphasizing equity issues a great deal. But to be fair, there were some of us who also felt that we were not, that it was like a one-sided view. And this is what I felt at the time, that it was a view that said, yes, development is paramount, which it is, but climate change is a serious problem, and we have to figure out creative ways of achieving development and addressing climate mitigation. So I'll talk you through the sort of shifts in that story over time, but I wanted to give you a little bit of an evocative picture first. So this is another snapshot of the negotiations in the Durban COP. And it's very, very interesting reflection of the politics. So here we have Mr. Rashmi, who was our lead negotiator, and Jayanti Natarajan, then our environment minister. This is an informal huddle that took place at the last minute in Durban over one very particular contentious wording issue that India objected to. And you will remember that in Glasgow, India was at the center of a similar storm around the language on coal phase out versus phase down. So this is history repeating itself. So you have the Indian negotiators over here. On this side, you have Mr. Pete Betts, the EU's negotiator, and Connie Hedegaard, the EU Minister for Environment, and they're squaring off. You have anxiously in the background some of the small island countries. This is somebody called Farhana Yamin, who's a lawyer who works with vulnerable nations. And over the shoulders of the two protagonists, like these sort of like hovering angels, you have Su Wei from China and the US negotiator, who are in a sense negotiating by proxy through India and the EU. And it's a really great picture because it kind of illustrates how these negotiations worked, where a lot of times the big players are actually acting in the background through their proxy players. So let me then take you back to how India's position, where India's position on these issues has been and how it has changed over time. And I will move a little fast because I want to get to some of the policy questions. But it's very important to understand these politics because they enable the policy questions. So the starting point for India, as many of you know, has been an ethical starting point. And there was this famous cartoon in a report put together by Agarwal and Narayan from CSE, Center for Science and Environment, trying to sort of make that point. And India has always seen climate change as a north-south issue, with the North having far greater responsibility for causing the problem, and the numbers bear that out. But what comes out of that, and this is a very important point, is that we have always thought of climate change as a diplomatic challenge, not a developmental challenge. It is something to be handled by a small number of diplomats in the Ministry of External Affairs, whose job it is to actually insulate the other areas of Indian policy making from having to think about climate change, right? So that's really important. So for about 20 years, that was the approach. We will do our energy policy, agriculture policy, and so on, in a sense, innocent of climate change. And I want to tell you about how that wall, if you like, has been punctured in the last few years. But let's just look at some information to talk, which helps us see what are the sort of underpinnings of this ethical perspective, right? So this is a really interesting graph because it's energy use per capita, which, as I'll show you later, is very closely tied to development. Against GDP per capita. And interestingly, this is on a log scale. So you can see that what this is actually this data, each data point of energy and economic growth from 1961 to 2017 that have been strung together in a trail. So India went from being here to being somewhere around here, right? So well below in both energy use as well as in both. Sorry, I'll show you here. So this is where India was in 2017, well below Western nations in energy use as well as in GDP. And because this is a log scale, we are well below them in GDP terms. What you can also see from this graph is the relationship between GDP and energy flattens out at higher levels. So it's steeper as you go up. If you look at China's trajectory, for example, and then it flattens out when you get to where Japan, for example, is, or the European Union is. So countries need energy to develop. India and the least developing countries have far lower levels of energy and GDP. So this, I think, tells the familiar story about low per capita emissions in a very evocative way, because it also tells you the relationship between emissions and GDP. So the story is, India needs more energy to develop. The question is, do we get that energy from low carbon sources or from higher carbon sources, and how fast can we make that pivot? But the fact that we need energy to develop, I think, is incontrovertible. So from this perspective, India looks like a vulnerable country, a country that should have a right to more emissions. But if you look at the annual emissions figure, so this is a figure that shows how countries' emissions have grown over time. You see that India, even though our per capita emissions remain quite low, and this is slightly old now, it's 2014 data, even though our per capita emissions have remained very low, we are now the world's third largest emitter, or fourth if you include the EU as a separate group. And what in the decade of the 10s and the 20s, what everybody observed was this red line of China, right? So China went from being half of the US emissions in 1990 to being double the US emissions in 2015. And the question was, is India going to do the same thing? Because if India does the same thing, then it's really game's over for addressing this issue. So India came under a lot of pressure, not because of anything we had done, but because people were watching China. So this is the kind of context around 2010 and so on that India found ourselves in, and which is why we were really emphasizing equity. Now I'm going to take you through 3 or 4 reasons why the picture has got more nuanced and more complicated. So the first is climate equity itself is not a simple story. It's not just about the North versus the South. It's also about the rich and the poor within India. There was a report done by Greenpeace called Hiding Behind the Poor, which basically said, look, there are people in India who have Western levels of life and emissions. So why should we be thinking of them separately? And if we are talking about emissions for the poor, what internal mechanisms do we have to make sure that those emissions actually go to benefit the poor? So they were, in a sense, puncturing this conversation a little bit. Another set of writers made the point that we should be focusing on vulnerability and that India has a lot of the world's vulnerable. And so we need to be thinking in terms of climate equity that not just looks at energy for development, but also looks at vulnerability. So this kind of, it didn't erase the equity conversation, but it complicated it. The second point was growing information about possible impacts on India and South Asia. I won't go through these, but it's the familiar sort of list. And the question became, well, look, if India is going to be challenged developmentally, those developmental challenges are going to be multiplied by climate change. The third shift is a shifting narrative on the energy story. So as I said, the energy for development story was the underpinnings of India's ethical stance. This point here about growing energy needs and so on and so forth. This is a curve that shows human development index and how it's very strongly correlated to energy consumption until a threshold after which it flattens out. But once you started seeing renewable energy getting more and more, getting less and less costly, energy efficiency started being seen as a way of achieving both development and climate objectives. So a lot of demand side measures like energy efficiency, energy efficient lighting, and so on. Energy security narratives came into play, saying, look, we are a fossil fuel scarce economy. It makes sense for us to start promoting renewable energy for our own sake, not just for climate reasons. And while it is conflicted, as we discussed at the end of the last session, the discussion around aerosols, people started talking about the air quality co-benefits of some actions, for example, around thermal power plants and so on and so forth. And so all of these things, the idea, and the air quality example is not the best example, but if you look at examples like public transport, right? So public transport is both a mitigation action, but more important, it's an action that would lead to more livable cities in India. So there were things that we could do for mitigation that didn't necessarily compromise development. So these things, this was a further factor that kind of softened the Indian position a bit. And the final, not least position was geopolitical drivers. So India was under huge pressure at meetings of the G8, G8+5, and the G20. We became part of the basic group of countries, which is Brazil, India, South Africa, and China. And Brazil and South Africa started taking on more and more measures. Over time, China signaled its willingness to do so. There were other geopolitical pressures. We want to be a responsible power. We want a UN Security Council seat. We want to cozy up to the US, and so on and so forth, right? So all of these things have led over time to India really changing or shifting the way we talk about climate change. And so, if you had to look at where we were back in 1990 and where we are perhaps today, or maybe at, let's say 2015, the center of gravity of the Indian position is this sort of co-benefits, that there are development choices we can make that would also bring climate gains. And this cartoon basically says, look, what if it's a big hoax and we create a better world for nothing, right? The idea being that it's a no regrets approach to do all the things on the screen, energy independence and green jobs and so on and so forth. So this has become, if you like, now the center of gravity of where India is. And then there's a real question, and I raise this as a question because I see a lot of young people, and I'm sure there are young people in this audience, the idea that climate is now an existential challenge that actually requires us to think even more deeply of whether the framework we've been using of a trade-off between development and climate change is an incomplete framework. So, for example, the Hindustan Times had an editorial where they said, we will no longer use the word climate change, we'll use the phrase climate crisis. That will be kind of the editorial stance we will take. And you've seen sort of youth movements in India emerging that parallel those elsewhere. And so the question is, are we on the threshold of that sort of change in India? In my view, we're not on the threshold of it, but it's not a trivial point of view. Okay, so what I want to do now is shift gears to some of the policy questions. I realize I took a little long on the political part of it, but I think it's quite important to understand how India has approached this question and why the development climate trade-off is really at the core of how we've thought about this. So what this graphic here shows is this will be familiar to many of you. It's kind of the SDG graphic, Sustainable Development Goals. So things like life on land, life below water, climate action, responsible consumption and production, sustainable cities, and so on. And what this graphic shows is that the thickness of each of these circles represents the extent to which there are synergies between these objectives and climate outcomes. So, for example, affordable and clean energy has deep synergies with climate change, while hunger, the no hunger SDG has far fewer. So this is a framework that says, look, let's not think about climate change as a distinct policy challenge. Let's think about climate change as part of a country's developmental challenges. And I think this is the framework that many countries are moving to, and that India is also moving to, and undergirds our approach. So what has India put on the table? I'm just going to run you through. So we have factually what India has put on the table, and then I'll give you some interpretation of that. So India's NDC that we put out at Paris, Nationally Determined Contribution, says we will reduce our emissions 33 to 35% below 2005 in intensity terms, right? And intensity of GDP. So it's emissions per unit of GDP. So this is really important because it says that India's emissions can grow as its GDP grows. It is just that we will try and restrict the rate of growth of emissions per unit GDP. In other words, we are pledging to become an ever more carbon efficient economy, but we're not actually pledging to become a low carbon economy. And it's really a very substantial difference. And the turn to when a country says that we will actually cap our emissions is a very important marker. And China has said that they will cap at 2030 levels. The second thing we said is that the non-fossil fuel share of our power capacity will increase to 40% by 2030. And I'll come back to this, but this is power capacity. It's not power generation. So this is saying we will build a lot more renewable energy. And this is something that, frankly, we're going to achieve very, very close to achieving even now when you include hydro and nuclear and so on. And we will also enhance our sinks of forests through enhanced forest cover. What's more interesting to me than these NDC pledges, and interesting because the NDC pledges, to my mind, as somebody who observes the policy scene, have not directly translated into very many changes on the ground. And I'll come back to why I think that is. But what we have is a series of domestic targets and policy directions. So we have national action plans, including these 8 missions. We have 22 state action plans. We have a domestic renewable energy target. We have had until recently a coal cess. But we are also projecting additions to thermal coal-fired capacity. We have a program for electric vehicles. We have a cooling action plan, and so on and so on. Now, the point I'm trying to make here is we already have a series of policies that are essentially developmental and sectoral policies that have implications for India's low carbon future. For example, the Kusum program basically promotes solar agricultural pumps. it is motivated far more by a way of trying to solve the problem of poor finances of the distribution companies than it is by climate change. But it will almost certainly have climate change benefits as well. So what we're seeing in India is we're addressing climate change through this indirect route, which is fine. I think in a sense, politics is the art of the possible. So we should address it in whatever way we can. But what we are ending up doing, in a sense, is finding things that have the incidental effect of addressing mitigation. And we're not doing it in a deliberate way. And I'll come back to this later. But what we're not doing is we're not intentionally seeking areas that have the greatest synergies or avoiding areas that have the greatest trade-offs between development and mitigation, which I think is how we should be thinking about this. Just to quickly update that slide, in Glasgow, the Prime Minister announced this Panchamrit pledge. It is not formally India's NDC as yet. And I have actually been quite critical of the way this was phrased. We did some, there are things in here that don't actually make a great deal of sense. So for example, we have two pledges that talk about electricity, renewable energy or non-fossil fuel capacity. One that says 500 gigawatts, one that says 50%. And so they actually imply slightly different things. We have a pledge that says we will cut down our net projected carbon emissions by 1 billion tons, but it doesn't say from what baseline. So it's actually very hard to know what is meant by this. Is this an annual reduction? Is this a cumulative reduction by 2030? Many of these things are not operationalized, and I understand the government is trying to sort this out. Then we enhanced our carbon intensity target from 35% to 45%. And the big one is this net zero emissions by 2070, which, to be perfectly candid, was entirely under a lot of pressure. And it was done under pressure because to declare Glasgow a success, they needed to be able to add up what countries were doing using this terminology of net zero emissions. And again, we can come back to this in the discussion, but a lot of these conversations are driven by modeling frameworks that allow modelers to project what global emissions would be in 2070. Much harder to project what India's emissions would be on the basis of a carbon intensity target, because it depends, of course, on what GDP is. Depending on the GDP level, you'd get a different emissions number. So the 2070, the net zero pledges allow for a much more straightforward arithmetic, in a sense, than the intensity kinds of pledges. What's also interesting is that across India, there's a lot of bottom-up, bubbling up sort of action. So states have these state plans, many of which are focused on adaptation, and many of them are driven by local concerns. So the one in Odisha talks about a lot about coal and about fly ash. The one in Rajasthan talks about desertification. So you see this kind of strategic bundling of local development and climate concerns. But what you also saw were these plans were substantially just kind of things that many state departments just pulled off the shelf. So for example, when I looked into these plans in Sikkim, there was a plan to move a bus depot from one part of the city to another that was declared a climate action. So there's a lot of this kind of just relabeling of things rather than very strategic thinking about what constitutes climate action. We've also seen a lot of things happening at the city level, many of which are about things like energy efficient street lights and so on and so forth. I want to just show you what this all has meant for how the machinery of government has worked, right? And this is actually quite startling, this figure. So pre-2007, the only places in the government of India where you looked at climate change was the Ministry of Environment, so it's this kind of peachish color, Ministry of External Affairs for negotiations, and Ministry of Power, and maybe a little bit the DST and the Ministry of Science and Technology. Once India came up with its national action plans, all the missions were embedded in various line ministries. And so all these ministries in yellow were added, and they all developed cells aimed at climate change. And you also created a Prime Minister's Office and the Prime Minister's Council on Climate Change over here as a coordinating body. The next generation in 2010, states got into the picture and cities. So all the bodies in green were layered onto this. And then since then, not much has changed. At some point, the Planning Commission went away and Niti Aayog showed up. But since 2014, not much has changed. So from a place where climate change, remember that I said that our objective was to treat climate change like a diplomatic challenge and try and insulate decision-making from climate considerations, where you can see how much that has changed in the last 10 or 15 years, because now climate change is part of the thinking of many ministries. So it'll surprise you perhaps to say that I nonetheless feel that one of the challenges for India is that we have an institutional vacuum when it comes to decision-making around climate change. And I mean this in two ways. The decision-making is still controlled by the Ministry of Environment, Forests and Climate Change as the nodal ministry. But as those of us who've engaged with government know, MOEFCC simply doesn't have the convening ability, doesn't have the power to bring more powerful ministries to the table. It doesn't have the power to tell them what to do. So for something that has the scale and scope of climate change, if you put it in the Ministry of Environment, you have no way of assuring the coal ministry, oil and gas ministry, agriculture, urban development are thinking about climate change or thinking about it in ways that the Ministry of Environment would like them to think about it. The other thing you don't have is you don't have a coordinating structure across all these ministries. They're all working at cross purposes. For a while, we had a Prime Minister's office, but that no longer exists. I don't want to dwell too much on this, but there are various options that one can look to other countries for models for how to deal with this. But the one thing I want to point out before I move on from this slide is the lack of a federal structure to inform states and encourage experimentation. So we don't have a very good system where states can experiment in terms of climate mitigation and adaptation, get support from the government of India, whether it's financial support, scientific support, and so on, and then share those lessons with other states. Because you can't cut states out of this. This can't entirely be the responsibility of the government of India. So what I want to sort of leave this discussion of policy with is that we have so far taken an opportunistic approach to policymaking in India. So we've looked at energy efficiency, and that has been a mission that has worked. We have ramped up solar power. That has been a ministry, that has been something that, of course, is increasing by leaps and bounds. But we're not looking at this in a structural or a systematic way. So on the one hand, we increase renewable energy. On the other hand, we increase our coal use, and we actually open ever more coal mines. And because we're talking about capacity increases of renewable energy as opposed to generation increases, there's no mechanism to trade off the coal versus the renewable energy electricity. And the risk is we will overbuild on both sides. So there's no systematic consideration of synergies and trade-offs around things like air pollution, around things like, are we trying to create not just renewable energy, but also create jobs in manufacturing tied to the renewable energy industry. We're not thinking about the fact that we are urbanizing at a very rapid pace, but we're not thinking through whether those urban development patterns are both climate resilient as well as maximally take advantage of efforts to reduce carbon. So one of the things that many of us have been arguing for is to start thinking about sectoral transitions that are multiple objective in nature. So these are sectors that are going through transition already. So we know that we're decarbonizing electricity. We know that we're going through a cooking transition in India. We should explicitly look at how we manage these transitions in ways that meet basic development needs, create jobs, address local environmental issues, and contribute to resilience and mitigation. In some cases, you'll do things that hit all those buttons. In some cases, there'll be trade-offs across them, and we need to understand those trade-offs. But we should be thinking in terms of large structural transitions, because India is a country going through that sort of phase where we are going through a demographic transition, a rural to urban migration, we're going through a massive infrastructure build out all at the same time. And we're not actually using this moment to try and avoid locking in high carbon futures, and instead trying to make the pivot to both more resilient and lower carbon futures. As I mentioned, one of the pitfalls is the institutional question. We don't have a place in the government of India or in states where knowledge on climate change is brought together. Instead, you have lots of think tanks like mine putting out models, working their networks, trying to get their ideas taken seriously. And in many cases, these are inconsistent ideas. I mean, in Delhi, there are think tanks putting out numbers about what is the financial need for India to achieve net zero by 2070, using technology cost numbers that are basically today's technology cost numbers, and nobody's really challenging them on it. So we don't actually have a place where knowledge is generated, screened, contested, debated, and the quality of it is improved. I'm going to talk a little bit more about this idea of shifting development pathways later on, but just to introduce it, the idea is that now for India, when we talk about climate change, maybe it's not a marginal issue that should be sitting in the Ministry of Environment. It should be thinking about whether the development choices we're making are choices that prepare us for both a climate impacts world, as well as a world where being low carbon means also being more competitive. But to do that requires unpacking a lot of puzzles. And I'm going to take you through a few of these puzzles with a little bit of data to try and illustrate how complicated this is. So the first question is, when we show up at negotiations, when we do our NDCs, we need to have some sense of India's future emissions, future trajectory, and so on. So this is a paper that a few of us did in 2015 when India was trying to put out its nationally determined contribution. So all these dots are different modeling studies. On the y-axis here is the 2030 projected emissions. So this is for one point in time, 2030 emissions. The axis starts at 2 tons, which is about India's 2015 emissions. And on the x-axis is different assumptions about GDP growth rate. And what you can see here is there's just a tremendous scatter of emissions. And this is over a 15-year period. We had models that projected 2 gigatons. We had models that projected more than 5 gigatons, right? So a more than 100% variation over 15 years. These two lines here are India's NDC projection, which is the 33 to 35% intensity reduction. If we meet that intensity reduction, we would be on that line somewhere. So you can see there are a number of studies. I won't go into this graph in too much more detail. We tried to sort of break up all the data into different categories of studies to try and make more sense of it. But what we were trying to do was provide some context to the government of India when they were presented with multiple model studies. So people just show up and say, here's our result. We think you should use this to inform your policy making. And our point was, you have no way of interpreting these numbers unless you sit and contextualize it a little bit better. And we need to get more transparency into how this is done. Let me just sort of unpack this a little bit deeper. So this is the same set of model studies and their projections on electricity supply in 2030, right? It's a key variable. So this is the total electricity supply, fossil fuel and non-fossil fuel as of 2015. And up here are all the projections in reference cases on the left of each column and in policy cases on the right of each column. So you can see, for example, fossil fuel, anywhere from a 200% increase to a 400% increase in fossil fuel use by 2030 under reference cases, and policy cases, a marginal increase up to about a 300% or multiplied by basically a tripling, essentially, of fossil fuel. This is what the models were projecting back in 2015. Now, here is my very amateur effort to add in this little orange line that is the Government of India's own Central Electricity Authority projections in 2019 for 2030. And you can see that the Government of India is now projecting fossil fuel power plants towards the bottom end of the policy projections. So well below any of the reference cases and at the lower end of the so-called low carbon policy cases. And so it is in just 5 years, this is what the picture looks like now as compared to what it looked like in 2015. The point we're making is that it's incredibly challenging to figure out what India's energy needs are and our development needs, and do it in ways that can inform policy. Let me, at the risk of stating the case, let me sort of expand on it a little bit. So this is a follow-up paper we did looking at the 2050 modeling statements, and for another subset of models, this is now emissions in 2050 with the size of the dot representing the amount of 2050 greenhouse gas emissions. And we plotted it a couple of different ways. We said, okay, let's look at the final energy intensity of GDP versus GDP. So this tells you something about how energy intensive your economy is. And this tells you about the carbon intensity of your economy. And again, these plots are all over the place. So for example, if you take this graph here, India's emissions are very, very large, according to this Markel study. This is a study by Terry. And they essentially assume that India would have a very, very high GDP, and it would its GDP would be on the back of quite a low energy use, as compared to this dot here, which suggests that the Remind study, which says that India would actually be an energy profligate economy, right? So what I'm trying to get at here, and I'm just going to make the point with this final graph in this section, is that these modelers are making assumptions not just about technology. They're making implicit assumptions about things like India's urbanization, India's industrialization, and that is what is actually driving the emissions futures. So let's just take this one. This graph on the left here tells us about industrial final energy consumption per capita. So basically, how much industry
sorry,
is using. I hope you can hear me. I'm getting a message that my.
Can you hear me? Hello, Dubash. We are having.
Sorry, Professor Dubash. We can't hear you too well. We are wondering whether.
Can you hear me now?
It's kind of choppy, and I just wanted to alert you to that. Okay, one suggestion is you shut the video off, but then I'm not sure you'll be able to see us either. Maybe we go along without the video for a little while, and then we restart the video if the bandwidth is it.
I'm now back, I think. Hopefully.
Yes. This is much better. Thank you.
Okay. All right. Good. So just to try and get through the rest of this, this graph here shows GDP per capita and industrial final energy consumption. This is where India was in 2018, the intersection of the red points. And by way of comparison, we've put a number of other countries. So for example, if you look at Korea, this is out where Korea was in terms of energy use and GDP. So well ahead of India. The various colored dots are what the modeling studies implicitly assume. So what's very interesting is this model here assumes that India is headed towards a China-like trajectory, whereas, say, this cluster here says India is going to become more like Argentina or Turkey by 2050. So the point we're trying to make here is that when you're thinking about India's emissions futures, it's not just about technology adoption. It's about fundamental decisions about what India is going to look like in the future. And that's why we call the paper Multiple Future Indias. So we have to be thinking about urbanization, manufacturing, job creation. All of these are now implicitly climate policies. The graph on the right makes the same point with regard to buildings. We are assuming, the models here are all assuming that India's buildings are going to become much more energy efficient because they all lie below the cluster of comparator countries. So we're making an assumption in these models that India's energy use from buildings is going to be much more efficient than past countries. So these are the kinds of questions that the models throw up. And what it means for policymakers is you can't talk about your emissions future without talking about your development future, right? So this idea of development pathways. Okay, I want to raise a second puzzle, if you like, which is how do we think about what net zero might imply for India? We have very, very few modeling studies. In fact, just one or two that explicitly try and do this. And they are very hard to take seriously because they project technology and other growth and so on and so forth out until 2070. As I like to say, 2070 is as far in the future as 1970 is in the past. And if you think back to 1970 and try and imagine any of us sitting in 1970 and imagining what 2020 would look like in terms of technology, in terms of energy, in terms of how society moves. We're talking about the Berlin Wall being up. The world was on the gold standard. We only had mainframe computers. There was certainly no app sharing devices. Oil was at $3 a barrel. It was before the oil crisis. Very hard to try and even speculate on what 2020 would have looked like in 1970. Yet we are trying to do something similar for 2070. So modeling studies can't tell you very much when you're 50 years off into the future. What I've got here instead is the IEA, International Energy Agency, has something which they call a Sustainable Development Scenario, SDS, for all the countries they model. So on the left graphic here, the red line is more or less the business as usual line of what they project for India's emissions. The blue line is their sustainable development line. Notice that it has India peaking its emissions today. India would start on a downward trajectory today. And this is a very ambitious trajectory. It would get you to net zero around 2060 or 2065. Now, what is the implication of that? So look on the right here. This graph shows you the IEA's SDS scenarios in dotted lines, right? So all the dotted lines are SDS scenarios or the sustainability scenarios. The solid lines are their business as usual scenarios. And what you see is the United States has to kind of deviate this much. In other words, to achieve the same GDP, they would have to reduce their emissions. They would have to change their trajectory by about this angle. The EU would have to change by this angle. India would basically have to affect almost a 90-degree transition. The direction of development of our economy would have to dramatically change if we were to make this kind of adjustment that would get us to net zero. The implications of that are incredibly hard to figure out. And the point is that some people in the policy space call net zero an opportunity, and they say, well, look, we can pivot to a low carbon future much faster, and that may be the case. Other people say, look, it really constrains our development choices, puts all the effort on the back of India's poor, and that may also be the case. We just don't know well enough, right? So we're operating in a context of very, very deep uncertainty about all of this. Excuse me. So what many of us have argued for is if you're thinking about a net zero future, we need to think about not just a net zero transition, but credible and just transitions to net zero. So in other words, if we're talking about a global reaching net zero by 2050, that doesn't mean that every country needs to reach net zero by 2050. These statements have to be credible, more than just statements of intent. And recently, there are some studies that have been put out that show that, for example, corporations that are putting out net zero targets are actually relying very heavily on purchasing credits and are doing very little upfront to reduce their emissions. So the net zero language has substantially complicated, to my view, what countries like India should think about in terms of policy. Because we're running out of time, I'm going to skip the next couple of slides, which basically talk about how we measure climate equity. I can come back to it in the conversation if people want. But I just want to end with two points. Just trying to think through all of these, and I anticipate that those of you in the audience will be better placed to figure out where your research should go. But here are some key gaps that strike me looking at the conversation today. So we really are in a difficult position when it comes to national models for emission scenarios that account for development pathways in the way that I've talked about. We have these scatter diagrams of different models without any effort at reconciling them, and it makes it a very difficult sort of space for policymaking. We don't do a very good job of analyzing the synergies and trade-offs across different development and mitigation objectives. A lot of people are champions of saying there are lots of co-benefits. Other people are champions of saying there are lots of trade-offs. We don't look at the question analytically often enough. I've spent most of my time talking about the mitigation side of things because that is what I work on most. But I think increasingly India has to start thinking much harder about how we are going to address the vulnerability that the average Indian has and how we're going to build our food systems, our urban systems, and so on in ways that are climate resilient. And we are building, but do not as yet have a system of providing policymakers at the local level, certainly at the district level and below, with downscaled climate impact science that is made accessible. Of course, Professor Srinivasan and many of his colleagues have been working on this. People at IITM have been working on this, but we don't have a mechanism really where the policy makers and the policy needs are addressed and seamlessly integrated with scientific understanding. There are going to be some key technologies in the next few years, things like battery storage, things like green hydrogen that are going to be extremely important. Each of them is not just a technical issue, but also a socio-technical transition because they involve institutional changes, they involve policy changes, they involve behavioral changes. We're not researching enough on both the technological side as well as the socio-technical transition aspect of these shifts. And finally, in part because of the net zero conversation, questions about the feasibility and desirability of different geoengineering options, whether it's solar radiation management or carbon dioxide removal, and the challenges and governance implications of these are going to become very big. So both the technical implications of it as well as the governance implications. So I just want to leave you with a few concluding thoughts. Having gone through this journey, going ahead, can India combine a concern for equity with a focus on accelerated mitigation, or is it always going to be this kind of trade-off language? Can we achieve energy for development and mitigation? How can and should India pivot from the kind of approach we've taken to policymaking, which is what I'm calling climate opportunism, to strategic climate policy? Instead of doing renewable energy on the one hand and coal on the other, should we be thinking about how we systematically transition without disrupting electricity for the poor to a low carbon electricity future, for example? Should we be thinking actively about a just transition for coal workers, recognizing that at some point in the next few decades, coal is going to become an unviable technology for the power sector? Should we be embracing this idea of development pathways and how they shape emission futures? If so, how do we model it? How do we hedge against imposing costs on the poorest? What is the scope for international finance to support these transitions? How do we prepare for socio-technical transitions in key sectors? I gave the example of green hydrogen that everybody is talking about now. How do we integrate climate resilience into sectoral decisions? How do we persuade ministries of agriculture, for example, that you now have to think about fertilizer use, water use, crop choice, MSP, etc., all of these things in ways that take into account the likelihood of climate impacts. What changes do we need in our science and technology institutions to do all these things? And what changes do we need in our legal and governance framework to bring about shifts in development pathways? Many countries of the world are already talking about climate laws. Many countries have passed climate laws. Chile has recently actually made a constitutional amendment to incorporate climate change. So this is sort of the scale of the transition and the challenge that I think we face, and we probably need to sort of scale up the ways in which we're thinking about it and address the problem with a sort of concerted energy and effort, and at the scale that it requires. So thanks very much for hearing me out. This is just a QR code to download this compilation of papers that I put out a few years ago. It's an edited volume, covers diplomacy, politics, policy. Apologies for the advertisement, but it's not really an advertisement because it's free. So my interest is just in getting all the contributors read. So please feel free to download the volume. Thanks very much.
Can you hear me, Professor Dubash?
Yes, I can hear you fine.
Well, thank you very much for a very stimulating talk, and one which raises so many questions. And I'm going to throw the floor open. Rama has a question. I'll pass the mic around. And also, if you're online, please raise your hand or post your questions in the chat box. Sandeep Juneja is monitoring. Sandeep, you tell.
So my question is about the net zero to be achieved by 2070. So from what you said, I gathered that we may not make this target. So what happens if many countries do not keep to these targets and these pledges are mere words? And is there any mechanism to deal with such things? Deal with promises broken?
Thank you. Should I take the questions as they come, or should we take? I can go ahead and answer this if that's how you'd like to proceed.
Yeah, sure. Just take them as they come.
Okay. Thank you. So it's a very good question. I actually am not sure that I am skeptical that we will not about getting to net zero by 2070. I actually think that we will very likely get to net zero by 2070. I think that the time frame is long enough that it's extremely hard to plan for. So it's not actually a time frame where it will drive action. So one of the reasons why countries have been urged to come up with net zero targets is because, for example, let's take countries that have said 2050 net zero targets. If they start building out, say, power infrastructure based on natural gas, and the modeling runs show that if you lock into new gas infrastructure, it'll make reaching net zero by 2050 very hard, then that should inform a decision today to avoid that infrastructure. So net zero can help you if you have already peaked your emissions and you need to get to zero by, say, 20, 30 years from now, right? So it can help with the decision making. For a country like India, where emissions are still increasing, net zero is not a useful metric, because we don't know whether we're going to increase a lot and then go down, or we're going to increase a little and then go down, whether our trajectory is going to be a mountain or a hill. So it's not something that actually informs our decision making very much. And it's also so far off into the future, which is to my mind, what is much more interesting for India is to think about sector by sector transitions. So we know we're going to urbanize. We know we have things going on in the electricity sector. We know we're thinking about freight corridors, whether they're rail or road. We should be thinking about all those decisions and figuring out how to maximize development and mitigation as kind of a joint function. But to get to your question about enforcement, no, in the Paris Agreement, there is no enforcement mechanism if a country doesn't do what it said it would do. The only mechanism is if a country fails to update its pledge, then that's a problem. But it's only a procedural obligation. So we are in a regime where international law has no mechanism to actually force countries to do what they said they would do. This is the whole Paris machinery is aimed at learning by doing, driving costs down through adoption, and encouraging countries to adopt faster. That is really how it's working, how it's meant to work.
Follow up and then to Rama's question. I hear what you're saying about the importance of sector-wise sort of planning, but just to ask you, from the scatter plots of various models that you showed, it was clear that our modeling efforts are, could do with improvement, let me say. And so do you think there is need or room for, sometimes it's called an integrated assessment kind of model in the Indian context? Or do you think there's just too much uncertainty for that to be too useful? And if you think it's useful, what sort of kind of a modeling effort might you think be what? Thank you.
So IAMs serve a very different purpose from the kinds of models I talked about here. IAMs are really about typically at a global scale, understanding emissions trajectories and factoring in damage functions as well. And it's really about having global conversations about how you allocate emissions reductions and how you do so in ways that are least cost. So the two slides I didn't show actually represented IAMs and different ways in which they were trying to slice equity. So for India to be part of that conversation on how you think about the global allocation of responsibility, having a homegrown IAM is in fact very useful. There are groups that run that are part of this this game, but it is really dominated by a few research organizations in Europe and the US. What I think would be as if not more useful for India is to figure out these national scale models that allow us to ask questions about development trajectories. So our models right now look at technology adoption. They look at, they don't even look at local pollutants, for example. They don't look at job creation. So they have none of the capabilities to actually answer questions that are really of interest to policymakers. And so part of it is a technical upgrading of the models, but part of it, frankly, is the process. The input assumptions, these modelers are just making up input assumptions without actually ground truthing them a lot. Like I said, some models assume India will become South Korea, others assume India will become China. The trajectories that they're, so it's highly unreasonable, for example, to assume that India is going to become an energy intensive manufacturing hub by 2050. I think that would be a long shot. Yet that is what some of the models implicitly assume. And the problem is that they implicitly assume it. If they explicitly assumed it and defended it, not a problem, but it's implicit. So that's where I think we really need to put some energies in the short run. And the government of India is alive to this concern and hopefully will do something about it.
Thank you. A few hands up.
I see a question on the chat as well.
Yeah, so on the chat, the question is from Kaushik Mutuchuru. Do you think we are in a need of a newer disruptive technology to reach the net zero targets, or it could be done with increased contribution from existing technologies? If you want to take your question now.
Thank you. So again, the only way in which we know the answer to this question are through models. And I sometimes feel like the climate policy conversation has been hijacked by models, and in a sense, we're trying to come up with answers that don't lead countries to change the facts on the ground, but that lead countries to make statements that, when plugged into models, give us happier answers. So what is the point, for example, of talking about a decarbonization of electricity in India when we have bankrupt distribution companies, when they are not reliable purchasers of power, because those who sell power are reluctant to sell to discoms because they're not sure they'll get paid. So unless you solve that problem of India's electricity sector, renewable energy or fossil energy, neither of them is going to actually be able to function effectively. So the models don't help us with the things that actually are some of the real obstacles. So will a new technology help? Yes, certainly newer technologies will help. Many people think that hydrogen and green hydrogen is going to be an important part of the story. But I don't think this is a problem that is going to be solved by a technological silver bullet. And one of the challenges, as I've said, of trying to project on net zero is it all depends on how much you want to use the net option. If you make very rosy projections on the cost of carbon dioxide removal technologies, then you can get to 2050 net zero without too much trouble. If you don't think that it's going to work out, then it becomes much harder. So there are just too many degrees of freedom to inform today's choices by plugging numbers into these models, which is why I have long been an advocate of saying, fine, let's talk about 2050 and 2070, but more important, let's talk about the next decade. Because if you reduce your emissions in the next decade, the physics of the problem are such that it's much more important than reducing emissions in the decade of 2040 to 2050. Right? You want to actually reduce your emissions today because it's the stock that matters in terms of radiative forcing.
So Professor Dubash, I have two questions. So one is, of course, net zero 2070, as you keep saying, it's very far away. Why not just plan, spell out a plan every 2 years? What are we going to do? What are our specific targets in a detailed manner? And maybe some agency does that for all the countries. So, whatever they've promised. So that would make it much more specific. So that's one question. Other was, you mentioned all these models. Since we are a scientific audience here, can you tell us typically what goes behind these models? I guess assumptions make all the difference, of course. But what's the kind of underlying mathematics? Is it just econometrics, or is it more sophisticated?
So I'm better equipped to answer your first question than your second, but I'll do my best. On the first question, I think countries are also required to come up with what's called a long-term strategy, an LTS, for the Paris Agreement. And the idea is that these LTSs would not just tell you about the 2050, 2070 targets, but would provide some interim targets. So there's a group of policy actors saying, look, when we rank and grade countries, we will look at whether or not they provide interim targets and not just these long-term targets. And I think that is the productive approach. It's the spirit behind the Paris Agreement that says every 5 years you enhance your target, right? So you tell the world what you're going to do on a 5-yearly cycle. And in a sense, as should be apparent by now, I'm among a relatively small minority that thinks the net zero stuff is not that helpful because it has distracted us from these 5-yearly cycles. So I think that is what should do. In terms of the models, there are different kinds of models. There are models that basically, for example, there are bottom-up models that are typically models around energy, trying to model changes in the energy system. So you make models, you make relatively fine-grained assumptions about the energy system, and then you basically put that through a series of equations that gives you a relationship between those energy outcomes and various other outcomes. You might have an econometric model that is based on an input-output matrix. So you start with an input-output matrix, and then you run that through a computable general equilibrium model, which every year spins through that input-output matrix. But you'll immediately see, as a technical person, the problem with these models, right? The input-output matrix for India is all the models use an input-output matrix that was developed in the late 1990s, when renewable energy wasn't even on the cards. So sometime around 2005, a few people tried to retrofit some of these input-output models with coefficients for renewable energy. But all those coefficients basically are coefficients based on technical relationships that we see today. They don't even necessarily hold 10 or 15 years out, let alone 30 or 40 years out. So once you start running these models 30 or 40 years out, they're just producing garbage, right? So, and many times these models are not even presented with sensitivity analysis or error bands or any of these things. I mean, there's one study that suggests that India will need $1.15 trillion to reach net zero in 2070. I mean, that's an astonishing degree of precision, which one really wonders about.
Well, the floor is open. Yes, Saravanan, you have a question.
Thank you. Thank you for the talk. I have many questions, but I'm not going to monopolize. I'll make one comment and I'll have one question. One is that I'm a physical science modeler. And one thing I've noticed is that 1.5 degrees target sometimes acquires a mythical status, which it shouldn't. People talk about overshoot and getting back to 1.5. It's like a cholesterol level. You're not going to get a heart attack. Your cholesterol crosses that point. You want to keep it below a certain level, but sometimes 1.5 becomes like people idolize it, which is completely unjustified. There is no tipping point at 1.5. There's no scientific evidence for that, and sometimes people act it. For non-scientists, that might be intimidating. So I'm just saying that. I find it odd. The second, that's just a comment. The second is I was a bit concerned about. You mentioned geoengineering because I think it's certainly worth doing research on, but putting it into a net zero framework, it seems dubious, and it's related to the net in net zero. You mentioned that too. I mean, the net in net zero is really abused because knowing a bit about carbon cycle model, it's very, very hard to predict if a forest will actually do what it's supposed to do and keep carbon or how much it'll keep. We really have to go to nearly zero, not net zero.
Yeah.
It has been nearly zero. Net is being abused, and people have pointed it
out. I couldn't agree with you more, actually, on both these points. So those who are trying to build a political consensus for action are trying to find ever simpler narratives to do that. The one point, it's very hard to mobilize. We've seen how powerful net zero or 1.5 has been as a mobilizing platform. But and so people argue that that's the reason why we should live with the dumbing down of the science, if you like. I am actually with you in saying that there are some real costs to that level of dumbing down. And in fact, my criticism of 1.5 from a political point of view, I mean, not only is there not sort of a clear scientific basis there, and before that, 2 degrees had the same kind of status. The problem is the Paris Agreement is built, as I said in answer to the first question, as a learning by doing mechanism. There are no levers, there are no enforcement mechanisms. It just tells countries, you will leap over the following hurdles. And then the hope is they find they can leap over the hurdles relatively easily, and then they will leap over higher hurdles in the future, and they will start running faster and so on. So it is a learning by doing mechanism. But when you come up to the 1.5 story, the time frame for 1.5 is so short that there's actually no time to have learning by doing. So countries were supposed to come back to the table in 5 years with enhanced pledges. Well, coming out of Glasgow, countries have been asked to come back with enhanced pledges by next year. And most countries are saying, wait a minute, we didn't even know that we just gave you our first round of 2020 pledges. We don't know if we can achieve them. On what basis do we enhance these pledges? So it's actually undercutting the mechanism. The second thing that's happened is, in order to get political agreement, so the net zero, I completely agree with you that the net zero story, people focus on the word zero without realizing that when you say net, it's an enormous fudge factor. As we've seen, for example, with corporations, right? So corporations have all jumped on the bandwagon and said, we're coming out with net zero targets. When you look at the fine print, many of them basically are well above actual zero by 2050. So it looks like there's a tailwind of political agreement, whereas in fact, countries and companies aren't changing that much about what they're saying. So in the build up to Glasgow, you had countries like Australia and Saudi Arabia declaring net zero targets, right? Because they're not going to be held to them. It comes back to the point also about putting much more emphasis on what you do in the next 10 years, because it's much easier for a politician to give a promise 50 years or 30 years into the future, especially when there's this net fudge factor, than to tell you actually what you will do in 10 years when he or she might be held accountable to it. So I worry about some of these directions quite a bit, and I take your point as being in the same vein.
Thank you. Well, what we can do is have one or two more questions, and then if Professor Dubash, you can stay on, maybe some of us can stay on for further discussion for 10-15 minutes with you.
Certainly.
For lunch, would that be possible?
Yes, happy to do that.
So maybe we take one question or so and then close the session in a formal way. And those of us interested can stay on and continue a kind of informal discussion. Anyone would like to, or online, is there anyone, Sandip, if you see anyone who wants to ask a question? I don't see a hand up. Maybe I'll take the opportunity anyway. I come back to, I think one of the points you mentioned, this has to do with India, and I'm not sure the word you used, perhaps it was downscaling the modeling effort in the sense of connecting to the needs of states and cities. And I think Dr. Krishnan from IITM will be speaking later on, and we have many experts. But I had the same sort of knowing very little general question, which is, of course, it's important to have on the national scale a modeling effort. But then when it comes to connecting it to more local agencies, there's considerable need, I would think, for a kind of in between, bringing even the model to a point where it can be run or can be adapted for local considerations. I wondered if you could comment on that.
Yes, those are the kinds of issues I was getting at, and indeed, Dr. Krishnan and colleagues at IITM are doing really good work. Somewhat outside their scope and responsibility, however, is to say, well, who are the people receiving that information, and is there sort of a feedback loop in terms of people who use that information being able to communicate back to IITM what forms that information is required in to be useful to them. That loop needs to be closed. The information needs to not just be at the right scale and of the right nature, but it actually needs to be in the form, on the time scale and so on, that actually informs these decisions. And so that is a process that I think we are, and I shouldn't overstep my bounds here because I don't know enough about what IITM is doing, and it may well be that they're well on their way to doing just that. But in many states, the states themselves haven't built the infrastructure to receive and use that information very well. So when I did field work around state action plans, it was one director sitting in a room with 30 or 40 other people, and he was typically a one-man show who was responsible for making the whole state climate resilient. And there were all these other departments that had their own incentives, that had their own projects, that had their own schemes. So how is one person supposed to leverage change in all of these things, right? So the politics and governance of how that happens in our machinery is quite complicated, and science can play an important role in that, but less so if people don't understand how that machinery works. So that conversation between those who govern and those who provide science could I think be taken further.
Okay, thank you. I don't see any hands up, neither online, I gather. So I think let's thank Professor Dubash for a really very stimulating lecture. And
thank you very much for inviting me.